Imagine this, you're minding your own business, just trying to get through your day, when suddenly, a police officer approaches. But instead of offering help or even just asking a question, he looks at you like you don't belong. That's exactly what happened to Mr. James Carter, a 72-year-old veteran who served his country with honor. Now retired, he moves around in a wheelchair, dealing with the struggles that come with age. But today, he's about to face something he never expected. An officer who sees his skin color before his service, his disability, or his dignity. It all started at a quiet bus stop in downtown Atlanta. Mr. Carter was waiting patiently, the way he always did, when Officer Reynolds showed up. From the moment he arrived, his attitude was clear. He saw a problem where there wasn't one. Without reason, without explanation, he started questioning Mr. Carter. "Where are you going? What are you doing here?" The tone was harsh, the suspicion obvious. And when Mr. Carter calmly responded, asking why he was being treated this way, things escalated fast. Within minutes, Officer Reynolds was demanding ID, accusing Mr. Carter of loitering, on public property, no less. A man who had once fought for the rights of others was now being stripped of his own. And then, before anyone could even react, the officer did the unthinkable. He grabbed Mr. Carter's wheelchair and forced him backward. The next thing anyone knew, the elderly veteran was being handcuffed right there on the sidewalk, his voice trembling as he pleaded for an explanation. But what happened next? That's where things take a turn no one saw coming. Because in the crowd, someone was watching. Someone who wasn't about to let this injustice go unanswered. The crowd around the bus stop had been small at first, just a few people waiting for their rides, scrolling through their phones, lost in their own worlds. But as soon as Officer Reynolds put his hands on Mr. Carter's wheelchair, the energy shifted. People started paying attention. A young woman with a camera phone was already recording, her brows furrowed in disbelief. A middle-aged man in a suit hesitated, his grip tightening around his briefcase, as if he wanted to step in, but wasn't sure how. Mr. Carter's voice cracked as he tried to reason with the officer. "I served this country. I have every right to be here." His hands, wrinkled with age, trembled slightly as the cuffs tightened around his wrists. But Officer Reynolds barely looked at him. His focus was on control, on making it clear who was in charge. From across the street, a man in a grey hoodie started walking toward the scene. He had been standing near a coffee shop, watching everything unfold. His pace was slow, calculated. No one knew who he was yet, but there was something in his eyes, a determination that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Meanwhile, the woman with the camera kept filming. "This is wrong," she whispered, shaking her head. "Someone has to do something." Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, but no one moved just yet. Mr. Carter, struggling to keep his dignity, let out a deep breath. "Son, you're making a mistake," he said, looking straight at Officer Reynolds. The officer didn't respond, but for the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in his expression. And that's when the man in the hoodie finally spoke. "Let him go," he said, his voice calm but firm. And just like that, everything changed. Officer Reynolds turned toward the man in the hoodie, his jaw tightening. "Step back," he ordered, his hand resting near his belt. The man didn't flinch. He just stared, his expression unreadable. The crowd around them grew restless, shifting on their feet, the tension thick in the air. The woman with the camera kept filming, her voice barely above a whisper as she muttered, "This isn't right." Mr. Carter, still trapped in the cuffs, sat quietly, watching the situation unfold. He had seen this kind of power struggle before, on battlefields, in protests, in moments where the world seemed to tilt unfairly against certain people. He knew this officer wasn't just trying to enforce the law. He was trying to prove something. The man in the hoodie took another step forward. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice steady. "This man is a veteran. He has every right to be here. And you're making a mistake that's going to follow you." For the first time, Officer Reynolds hesitated. His grip on Mr. Carter's wheelchair loosened just a little. But then, As if remembering the eyes on him, he straightened his back, his face hardening. "I said step back," he repeated, louder this time. From behind, the woman filming spoke up. "Why is he under arrest?" she asked. "What did he do?" The officer glanced at her but didn't answer. The silence only made things worse. More voices joined in. "Yeah, what's the charge?" "He was just waiting for the bus." "This isn't right." Mr. Carter looked around at the faces surrounding him, people he had never met but who now stood for him. He exhaled slowly, a glimmer of hope flickering inside him. But he knew better than to trust hope too soon. This wasn't over. Not yet. Officer Reynolds' grip on his belt tightened, his knuckles turning white. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were questioning, pushing back, demanding answers. His eyes darted around, scanning the growing number of phones pointed in his direction. The tension in his shoulders was visible, but so was his stubbornness. He wasn't about to back down, not now. Mr. Carter sat still, his expression calm, but his heart pounding. He had faced fear before, but this was different. This wasn't a war zone or a battlefield. This was home. And yet, here he was, treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked up at the officer, searching for something, reason, regret, maybe even a sliver of doubt. But Reynolds' face remained unreadable. The man in the hoodie didn't move, standing his ground. "You know this isn't going to end well for you," he said, his voice steady. "Everyone here sees what's happening." His eyes flicked toward the woman with the camera, then to the others who had pulled out their phones. "It's already out there." Reynolds exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. You could feel the pressure closing in on him. He had started this, but now, for the first time, he wasn't sure how to end it. His training told him to maintain control, but control was slipping through his fingers. A siren wailed in the distance. The sound cut through the thick air, making everyone pause. Another officer was on the way. Would they back up Reynolds? Would they see the truth? The crowd seemed to sense it too, the urgency crackling like electricity. Mr. Carter lifted his head, his voice strong despite the situation. "You still have a choice, son," he said. "Do the right thing." And then the moment of decision arrived. The sound of the approaching siren grew louder, cutting through the heavy tension. The crowd shifted, some glancing toward the street, others keeping their eyes locked on Officer Reynolds. His jaw clenched, sweat forming at his temple. He was running out of time, and he knew it. His grip on Mr. Carter's wheelchair tightened again, but his movements weren't as sure as before. Then, just as the flashing lights of another patrol car appeared in the distance, something unexpected happened. The man in the hoodie slowly reached into his back pocket. A few people in the crowd gasped, some stepping back, unsure of what was about to happen. Even Reynolds tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he held up a badge. "I'm Detective Marcus Lane, Internal Affairs." His voice was clear, cutting through the noise like a blade. "And I've been watching you for a while, Officer Reynolds." The entire scene seemed to freeze. The crowd, the murmuring, even the distant siren, it all faded for a split second as Reynolds' face turned pale. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to Marcus' face, trying to process what was happening. Mr. Carter, still seated in his wheelchair, exhaled slowly, watching the shift in power. "Well now," he muttered under his breath. The second patrol car pulled up, doors opening quickly. Two officers stepped out, but they weren't focused on Mr. Carter anymore. They were looking at Reynolds. "Step away from him," Marcus ordered. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. "Right now." Reynolds didn't move at first. His mind was racing, searching for a way out. But this time, there wasn't one. And for the first time since it all started, he was the one under the spotlight. Reynolds stood frozen, his breathing shallow. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and for the first time, he looked unsure. The other officers approached cautiously, their hands resting near their belts, not to defend him, but to act if necessary. The shift was undeniable. The power he thought he had was slipping away. Marcus stepped closer, his badge still visible. "You've been under investigation for weeks," he said, his voice even. "Excessive force complaints, harassment reports. This was just the final straw." The crowd murmured, their whispers turning into hushed excitement. The woman with the camera zoomed in, capturing every second. Mr. Carter sat silently, watching it all unfold. He had seen men crumble before, but this was different. This was justice catching up in real time. Reynolds swallowed hard. "This is a mistake," he muttered, but the words had no weight. "Turn around," one of the arriving officers said firmly. "Hands where we can see them." For a moment, it looked like Reynolds might resist, but then, click. The same handcuffs he had slapped onto Mr. Carter just minutes ago were now locked around his own wrists. The crowd let out a mix of gasps and quiet cheers. The woman with the camera whispered, "Unbelievable." Marcus turned to Mr. Carter and knelt slightly, speaking in a lower voice. "I'm sorry this happened, and I promise, it's not over yet." Mr. Carter nodded, his face unreadable. "I've been through worse," he said, "but I appreciate it." Then, just as things seemed settled, a voice called from the back of the crowd. "Wait, look at the wheelchair." Everyone turned. There, on the side of Mr. Carter's chair, was a small, barely noticeable scratch, where a tiny black device had been attached. Marcus' eyes narrowed. He reached out, carefully pulling it free. A hidden tracker. The crowd fell silent. Mr. Carter stared at it, his face darkening. "That wasn't there before," he said slowly. Marcus turned the device over in his hand, his expression serious. "This just got bigger than we thought." Marcus turned the small black device over in his hand, his expression darkening. The crowd, once buzzing with energy, now stood in stunned silence. Mr. Carter stared at it, his fingers tightening around the arms of his wheelchair. "Someone's been watching me," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The weight of the realization settled over everyone. This wasn't just about one officer abusing his power. Something bigger was at play. Marcus pocketed the device carefully. "We'll look into this," he assured Mr. Carter. "But for now, let's get you out of here." One of the officers helped remove the cuffs from Mr. Carter's wrists. He flexed his fingers, wincing slightly but keeping his dignity intact. A few people from the crowd stepped closer, offering quiet words of support. The woman with the camera nodded at him, still recording but with a softer expression now. As Reynolds was led away, his face was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. The man who had tried to control everything had lost it all in front of the very people he had tried to silence. Mr. Carter took a deep breath. "I just wanted to catch my bus," he said with a small, tired chuckle. Marcus smiled slightly. "Let's make sure you get home safe." As the crowd began to disperse, the tension in the air finally lifted. People went back to their lives, but something had changed. The video would spread, questions would be asked, and the truth, whatever it led to, would come out. Mr. Carter wheeled himself forward, pausing just for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly to Marcus. Marcus nodded. "You're not alone in this." And with that, the moment passed, but the story was far from over.